All right, so early March 2025, and things are getting interesting.
Yeah.
The U.S. and Ukraine, if you're following the news, you see there have been some pretty sharp turns, and we have a lot to unpack today.
Yeah, for sure.
We've got some fascinating sources. A bunch of articles we're going to look at from, the Kiev Independent, Reuters, Fox News, the New York Times, and then also some excerpts from briefing documents.
Okay, cool.
All of this stuff centers around some recent statements from Secretary of State Rubio, and then also some stuff coming out of the Kremlin.
Interesting.
Yeah. So what do you think when you just look at this right off the bat? I mean, what's your impression just looking at these sources?
I think what's fascinating is just how quickly things seem to be changing, Especially when we look at the signals coming out of the U.S. administration.
Yeah.
It really feels like there's a fundamental kind of rethinking of the approach to this conflict.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to try to make sense of all of this for you. We're going to try to pull out the crucial insights from all these different pieces and give you a clear understanding of what's happening.
Yeah.
And we're going to focus in on, this apparent change in U.S. policy, this idea of a proxy war that keeps coming up, and what's going on with all these diplomatic efforts, especially the talks in Saudi Arabia.
Right. And I think, when you start putting all these pieces together, you start to see some pretty significant connections. Like, for instance, the way that this conflict is being framed as a proxy war, it doesn't seem like it's just talk. It seems like it's actually directly influencing these policy shifts and the strategies that are being employed in these diplomatic efforts.
Okay, so let's start with that. Let's start with this proxy war label.
Sure.
Right. Secretary Rubio, he's been pretty explicit.
Yeah.
He's described the war as a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia.
Right.
What's the logic there? I mean, what's the underlying logic based on what we're seeing?
Yeah, so the reasoning that Rubio presents, it seems to have a couple of key parts. The first is just the sheer scale of support that the U.S. is channeling into Ukraine. Think military hardware, think financial aid, think intelligence sharing in all of this without actually putting American boots on the ground.
Right.
And then second, when you zoom out a little bit, you see this as a strategic showdown between these two major nuclear powers. Even if the fighting itself is happening in Ukraine, Ukraine's doing the fighting, but the broader implications definitely involve the U.S. and Russia.
And it's interesting, too, because this framing, this way of looking at the conflict, it's not a new thing coming from the Kremlin, is it?
Not at all.
Putin has been using this type of language for a while now.
Exactly. I mean, the Kiev Independent actually points out how Rubio's comments seem to echo this long-held narrative from the Kremlin.
Yeah.
Putin has been saying for a while now, that the West is basically fighting Russia with the hands of Ukrainians. So for a U.S. Secretary of State to use this exact proxy war terminology, that's a pretty significant alignment, at least in terms of framing.
It is. And it's not just Putin either. We see Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, he actually echoed Rubio's assessment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he stated that Moscow views this as a conflict between Russia and the collective West.
Okay.
With the U.S. very much in the driving seat.
Wow. So this raises a really interesting point. If both Washington and Moscow, perhaps for different underlying reasons are converging on this proxy war description, what does that actually mean for how this conflict is perceived and, how it might actually be resolved?
Yeah.
I mean, could this lead to a greater understanding of the high stakes involved for these major powers and maybe open a path to de-escalation between them? Or could it actually have the opposite effect?
Yeah.
Could it actually harden positions, with each side seeing the conflict purely through the lens of this broader geopolitical rivalry?
It's a huge question.
Right, it is.
So let's turn our attention to the U.S. policy, because there's been this apparent shift in U.S. policy, and the sources point to a pretty significant change in how the Trump administration is actually approaching the war. So what are the main things that we're seeing?
Yeah, so the briefing documents give us a pretty clear picture here.
Okay.
It seems like the Trump administration has come to the conclusion that this war has become protracted and reached a stalemate, and they're moving away from the idea of open-ended support for Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that they paused all U.S. military aid and they've suspended some intelligence sharing following that pretty tense meeting between Trump and Zelenskyy in the Oval Office back on February 28th. It really underscores this.
Yeah.
And the fact that rare earth minerals deal didn't get signed, that seems to have been a key point of friction there.
Yeah, that Oval Office meeting, I mean, all the accounts we have suggest it was a pretty strained exchange.
Yeah.
And Rubio himself, he stated pretty plainly that continuing to provide Ukraine with weapons indefinitely is not a strategy. This is a pretty stark contrast to the previous U.S. stance.
It is. It really signals a shift towards prioritizing an end to the conflict, even if that end, might not fully align with Ukraine's initial goals. And then, we see reports that the Trump administration is actually considering lifting sanctions on Russia that were imposed after the full-scale invasion.
Wow.
And this further emphasizes this change in priorities. And if we loop this back to the proxy war idea, you could interpret this as the U.S. seeking to reduce its direct engagement in this wider geopolitical contest.
So it sounds like the focus now is really on diplomacy.
Yeah.
Trying to get Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table.
Right.
And Rubio has said that explicitly, that is the administration's priority, is to bring both countries together to find a resolution.
Absolutely. And Rubio's statements, in the lead up to the Saudi Arabia talks, they really reinforce this.
Yeah.
He talked about, wanting to engage with both sides and actively trying not to sabotage President Trump's plan to do so.
Right.
He also noted that the upcoming discussions with Moscow would be essential to understand, what Russia might be willing to concede. So this really indicates, a more proactive diplomatic push from the U.S. rather than simply, backing Ukraine's military efforts.
Okay, and it seems like the U.S. is going into these diplomatic efforts with the expectation of concessions.
Yeah.
Rubio stated that ending the conflict will require concessions from both sides.
Right.
And quite significantly, he specifically pointed to Ukraine needing to make territorial concessions.
Yeah.
Regarding land taken by Russia since 2014.
This is a really critical development. It marks a potentially major shift in the public U.S. position, right? Openly suggesting that Ukraine might actually have to cede territory as part of a peace agreement.
Yeah.
And Rubio's justification, according to the reports, is the assessment that a purely military solution where Ukraine retakes all of its lost territory is unlikely to be achievable, in a realistic time frame.
So Ukraine is reportedly considering proposing a pause on long-range airstrikes and attacks at sea.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we interpret that? Is that a preemptive concession, or is it a gesture towards de-escalation as these talks get underway?
I mean, it definitely has the hallmarks of a move that's intended to build some confidence, and signal a willingness to find common ground.
Yeah.
By suggesting a pause in these specific types of military actions, Ukraine might be trying to show, that they're serious about engaging in meaningful negotiations and finding a path towards de-escalation, even if it involves making some very difficult choices.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into these Saudi Arabia talks.
Okay.
March 11th, 2025. They seem to be a focal point in all of this. What do we know about what was actually discussed?
Right. So the reports indicate that the key discussions in Jeddah between the Ukrainian and U.S. delegations, they centered quite heavily on Ukraine's potential willingness to make these difficult compromises for the sake of peace.
Okay.
The possibility of a ceasefire specifically in the air and at sea, that was reportedly on the agenda.
Right.
The minerals deal that we talked about earlier, that was also discussed, although Rubio downplayed its immediate significance, in the context of these broader peace talks.
Yeah. And he was clear that the U.S. would not be providing military aid to Russia.
Right.
Probably goes without saying, but it's good to have on the record.
Absolutely.
The White House even highlighted these talks as an early achievement of President Trump's first 50 days.
Wow.
So they're putting a lot of weight on these.
Yeah.
And the Kremlin, through Dmitry Peskov, stated that Moscow expects to receive updates from Washington on the progress of these talks, which really highlights this interconnectedness of these diplomatic efforts.
He really does.
Andriy Yermak from the Ukrainian presidential office, he expressed some cautious optimism regarding a potential ceasefire, saying it has never seemed closer.
Right.
But he also emphasized the critical need for security guarantees.
Yeah. Those security guarantees are going to be key for Ukraine.
Yeah. And Rubio also brought up the essential role of European leaders in any final resolution. And he specifically mentioned their existing sanctions on Russia, suggesting that the U.S. recognizes the limits of its own influence and the necessity of a broader international consensus to achieve a lasting peace.
Exactly. A sustainable resolution will almost certainly require, the active involvement and agreement of these European partners, particularly because of their economic leverage, through the sanctions regime.
Right.
So Rubio's comment really acknowledges this fundamental reality.
So let's talk about this relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine, because it seems strained.
It does, yeah.
And this verbal spat in the Oval Office, sounds like it really had some consequences.
Yeah, it does.
But what else did we find out about that?
So the sources detail President Trump's accusation that President Zelenskyy was not truly ready for peace.
Oh.
In response, Zelenskyy apparently sent a formal letter to President Trump expressing his readiness to engage in these peace talks and to finally sign that long-discussed minerals deal. And then there's this reported claim from Steve Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, that President Zelenskyy actually apologized to President Trump for this Oval Office incident during a subsequent visit to Moscow.
Wow.
And, if this account is accurate, it really underscores the level of tension in the relationship and Ukraine's apparent desire to repair it.
It definitely paints a picture of a U.S. administration that feels its efforts to push for a negotiated settlement are being, at least in President Trump's view, hampered by Ukraine's stance.
Right.
Okay, well, let's shift to Russia. What are the sources telling us about Putin and the Kremlin?
Yeah, so the ISW report, the Institute for the Study of War report, which is referenced in several of our sources, paints a pretty firm and uncompromising picture.
Okay.
They suggest that neither President Putin nor the broader Kremlin leadership has offered any significant concessions and are in fact still demanding complete Ukrainian capitulation and a rollback of NATO's presence in the region. While Secretary Rubio has mentioned the need to understand Russia's demands, these reports indicate that those demands remain maximalist. Including substantial territorial gains, the deployment of peacekeepers on Ukrainian territory, and a guarantee of Ukraine's neutrality.
Right.
Essentially a fundamental reshaping of Ukraine's sovereignty and its security alliances.
So it seems like there's a pretty significant gap between what the U.S. is aiming for, concessions from all sides, and what Russia is insisting on.
There is.
Which, throws a wrench in the works when it comes to reaching any kind of negotiated settlement.
It really does, and it highlights the inherent difficulty of this entire diplomatic endeavor.
Yeah.
While the U.S. is actively pushing for compromises and a negotiated end to the conflict, Russia's reported maximalist stance suggests that they might not be genuinely interested in a mutually acceptable compromise at this particular stage. So it really begs the question of what leverage the U.S. or indeed any other international actor truly has to compel Russia to come to the table for meaningful and good faith negotiations.
Yeah, and our sources also touch upon the involvement of other international players.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia hosting these talks is certainly noteworthy. And President Zelenskyy meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman just before the U.S. delegation arrived, suggests that Ukraine is also actively pursuing its own diplomatic channels.
Right.
And we saw that there were over 30 nations participating in security talks regarding Ukraine in Paris, which coincided with the Jeddah meetings.
Yeah, this really underscores the point that the resolution of this conflict won't occur in isolation.
Right.
There are numerous international actors with significant stakes in the outcome.
Yeah.
And their involvement, whether through facilitating talks or providing various forms of support or imposing sanctions, will undoubtedly play a crucial role in shaping the final resolution.
Right.
And the sheer number of nations involved in the Paris talks really signals a broad international concern for Ukraine's long-term security.
Okay, so let's step back
Okay.
and try to synthesize all of this. What are the key takeaways that emerge from this deep dive?
So firstly, we see a clear shift in U.S. policy under the Trump administration,
Yeah.
prioritizing negotiation and explicitly expecting concessions from Ukraine, which potentially includes territorial adjustments.
Right.
Secondly, this framing of the conflict as a proxy war is now a shared perspective between both the U.S. and Russia, although their underlying motivations for using this framing likely differ.
Yeah.
And thirdly, these significant diplomatic efforts are underway, as we see with these talks in Saudi Arabia, but they're unfolding against a backdrop of a noticeably strained relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine and seemingly very firm maximalist demands coming from Russia.
And it really does feel like we're at a crossroads.
It does.
Russia's report demands this shift in U.S. policy. They raise some serious and uncertain questions about Ukraine's future and the broader geopolitical landscape.
Absolutely. This complex interplay of major global powers' interests, Ukraine's fundamental right to sovereignty and territorial integrity, and then just the truly devastating human cost of this ongoing conflict.
Right.
All of this combines to create a deeply intricate and unpredictable situation.
It does. So for you, our listener, consider this. Given this complex web of great power interests, Ukraine's sovereignty, and the human cost of this war, what do you see as the most likely paths forward for its resolution?
Right.
And what are the critical factors that will determine the outcome? What does this apparent shift in U.S. policy suggest about the future of international support for nations facing aggression? It's a lot to think about.
Food for thought.
Absolutely.